Good evening. My name is Tristram Hunt. I'm the Director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the online conference, Ceramics from Islamic Lands. It's my pleasure to open this week's proceedings, and I'm delighted that the V&A is hosting this conference, which has been organised by Mariam Rossa Owen, Curator Middle East in the Asia Department, with Leslie Mickelson, Curator of Collections and Exhibitions at Shangri-La Museum of Islamic Art, Culture and Design in Honolulu. The conference has been in gestation since 2018, but the confluence of two exhibitions currently showing at the V&A provides the perfect opportunity for hosting the programme this week. First, Epic Iran, the UK's first major exhibition in 90 years to present an overarching narrative spanning 5,000 years of Iranian art, design and culture, is now showing at the Victoria and Albert Museum until the 12th of September. Secondly, Mariam's display in our ceramics galleries, Contemporary Ceramic Art from the Middle East, is open until the 17th of October. And this is the first show dedicated to exploring the theme of contemporary ceramic art from across this region and its diaspora. The V&A, as you know, houses one of the greatest collections of Islamic ceramics in the world. And this is why it makes sense for us to host this brilliant conference. The V&A is the UK's designated national collection of ceramics, and our Middle Eastern holdings range from the earliest type of glazed wares made in the 7th and 8th centuries across all the regions and technologies developed under Islamic rule. Today, V&A curators are actively opening up these collections for 21st century audiences. Ceramics chart the history of Islamic civilizations and their reaches. The durability of the material means that it survives as an archaeological record better than any other medium. Changes in shapes, forming methods, glazing technologies, body fabrics and approaches to design allow scholars to speculate on exchanges and influences across cultures and vast geographical spaces. Technological breakthroughs made by Middle Eastern potters at an earlier date, such as the invention of tin glazing, decoration in cobalt blue, luster, artificial bodies, have had a defining effect on other cultures. One obvious breakthrough in methods of fabrication are the blue and white wares made in Iran in the 17th century, of which the V&A has an important collection, responding to, indeed imitating, Chinese wares traded by the Dutch and testifying to the complexity of pre-modern global interconnectivity and trade. In the 19th century, Islamic ceramics were amongst the most sought after by connoisseurs of the decorative arts, especially Hispano-Moresque and Persian luster wares, Iznik wares, and Damascus tiles. The impact of these ceramics on global arts and crafts movements was huge, exemplified by extraordinary figures such as William de Morgan, who first began his explorations into Middle Eastern glazed technology with his commission for the Arab Hall at Leighton House, not far from here at the V&A in South Kensington. Initiatives established by colonial administrations led to revivalist movements within the Islamic world, as well as the invention of craft traditions, many of which are now considered to be authentic. Contemporary ceramic artists in the Islamic world and the diaspora are engaging with, reinventing and reimagining the techniques and styles of the past, as well as creating new stories. All of these themes and many more are reflected in the proceedings of the conference. The pre-recorded papers discuss themes ranging from significant archaeological finds, ceramic technology and technique, trade across the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean and the Silk Roads, contacts with Europe, architecture and tile work, collecting history, continuity and change in the 19th century, modernism and contemporary artistic practice. The regions discussed encompass the Islamic West, the Middle East, Central Asia, South and Southeast Asia, Africa and Europe. This event marks the first international conference dedicated to such a range of papers and themes addressing ceramics from Islamic lands. The online format of this conference means that we can come together from all over the world. Our speakers come from across the UK and Europe, the USA and Canada, Australia, Lebanon, Turkey, Japan, India, and we are particularly grateful to have a number of colleagues joining us from Iran, many of whom would have found it difficult to come to the V&A in person. We've also had an astonishing amount of interest from people right around the world, so we're really delighted to welcome you to this online format. Finally, I'm delighted that Professor Lisa Gollenbeck has agreed to open proceedings from this evening with her keynote lecture entitled Recycling the Safavids, the Case of the Garden Panel. I will now hand over to Mariam to begin the formal introductions. Mariam.
Thank you very much, Tristram. Good evening, everyone. I'm Mariam Rosser-Owen, curator in the V&A's Middle Eastern section, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first event of our conference, Ceramics from Islamic Lands. I would also like to wish all of our Muslim participants a blessed Eid al-Adha. As Tristram mentioned, we've been thinking about this conference for a long time and originally planned to hold it as an in-person event at the V&A in December 2020. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, it quickly became obvious that this was not going to be possible, but it took us several months to work out how to make it happen in an environment that was rapidly shifting online. This has been an experiment for the V&A, and first and foremost, I would like to thank all the people across the museum who have made this week's conference possible. Joe Norman, the director of the V&A Research Institute, VARI, under whose aegis this conference is being organised, and in particular Claudia Heiderblut, VARI administrator, who has been the main logistics person all the way along and was not at all phased when I said I wanted to organise 8 panel discussions and a keynote lecture. Alex Spreadbury, Marco Carini and Oliver Orwell in our AV team and Tom Windross in our digital media team have been amazing at supporting the technical side of this conference. Marco stitched together all the speakers' pre-recorded presentations into the films by panel. Tom set up the Vimeo page where you've been able to watch these, and these will still be accessible to registrants for 2 weeks after the conference. And Oliver has made sure all of our speakers can safely connect to their panel discussions, and is supporting the conference behind the scenes all week, actually from within the walls of the V&A. Many other colleagues in our contact centre, marketing and IT departments have also been involved in setting up the registration page and sending out mail outs to all attendees, and I'm very grateful to all of them too, especially when we kept asking them to increase the registration capacity, not having foreseen quite how popular this conference would be. Kerry Wright in the Asian department and many colleagues in our finance department are also supporting the financial administration of the conference. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for their patience during the months it took us to figure out how to deliver this conference. They've endured long periods of silence, followed by a flurry of emails and endless forms to fill out, and have been patient and gracious in tackling technology to pre-record their presentations. We're really excited to have such high quality papers on such a wide range of topics that reflect new research and new trends in this field, and thank them all for their participation. We're also really thrilled by the quality of our moderators and look forward to the discussions that they will lead during the week. I would also like to thank all the colleagues who submitted paper proposals after our original call for papers. Again, we did not anticipate the popularity of this subject, and we received around 150 proposals. Even adopting the format that we are using, which is aimed to maximise the number of participants, we could not include everyone, and I'm sorry to those of you whose papers we could not accept. But I'm very happy to see many of you in the audience and look forward to your participation in our discussions during the course of the week. Margaret Graves and Martina Rujadi both very kindly agreed to serve on our conference committee and to help us with the task of long listing and shortlisting papers and then forming them into panels. And they're both acting as moderators for panel discussions this week. And last but absolutely not least, I want to thank our wonderful intern, Alyssa Gregory, who managed the conference inbox and all the communications with speakers and potential speakers over the course of the last few months. We would not be here today without her. Finally, thank you to all of you out there for joining us. A definite advantage of the digital platform for this conference is that we can accommodate 4 times the number of attendees whom we would have been able to fit inside the V&A's physical lecture theatre in South Kensington, and we can come together from all over the world. I look forward to seeing you at our panel discussions throughout the coming week. So just a quick reminder of the format of the conference. Apart from tonight's lecture, all the papers have been pre-recorded, and you can watch these at the Vimeo link that was sent out in the conference pack. The sessions this week will be live discussions between the speakers in each panel. They will give brief recaps of their papers in case you've not been able to watch the papers beforehand. And the recorded presentations will be available for you to watch for another 2 weeks after the end of this week. And we're also going to be recording all of the panel discussions, which will be posted on the V&A website at a later date. So enough from me. I'm now going to hand over to my co-organiser, Leslie Mickelson, who will be moderating this evening's keynote lecture. Welcome again, and I hope you enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Miriam. I would like to echo the thanks to the many people who helped organize this conference, as well as to all of our speakers. Aloha from Honolulu. I am speaking to you from the archipelago of Hawaii and would like to acknowledge its traditional owners and caretakers, the Kanaka Maoli, Native Hawaiian people. The genesis for this conference was a conversation that Miriam and I had several years ago now about the retirement from Oxford of Professor Oliver Watson. We mused on his significant role in both of our professional lives as a mentor and as a friend, and how he merited both fetting and a festschrift. That conversation turned into a larger one about the myriad roles of the interpretation of Islamic visual and material culture. And as the planning gained form and steam, it seemed wholly appropriate to both of us that this conference would best honor Oliver by focusing on the greater field of Islamic ceramics, as well as their contemporary curation at several concurrent exhibitions at the V&A. Although personal reasons have temporarily kept Oliver from the conference, we look forward to hearing his planned address at a future event. In the course of our planning, we were very surprised to learn that there have been very few large-scale conferences wholly dedicated to the field of Islamic ceramics, and were pleased when there was such interest in exploring this topic with colleagues both emerging and established. We thank you all for your enthusiasm and support, which has sustained us over the long months of planning first an in-person conference and then the necessary accommodations due to the global pandemic. As Tristram and Miriam have both noted, however, a wonderful upside to the digital format is that we are able to host many more participants than in a traditional lecture hall for colleagues truly around the globe. Thank you for making time from your busy schedules to join us this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, wherever you may be. Miriam and I are particularly pleased at the breadth of our conference, from archaeological excavations to material science, from connoisseurship to collecting, from the early Islamic period to the present, as well as, of course, the wide range of voices from whom we will be hearing over the next week. It was important to us that the conference acknowledge the rapidly multiplying fields of Islamic art, or rather Islamic arts, both in geographic and temporal terms, that contribute to and shape this discipline. We are also very pleased to provide a platform for the amplification of emerging voices, in addition to our more established peers. The quality of the presentations has whetted our appetites for the conversations to come, and I hope to see and hear from many of you in the week ahead. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Dr. Lisa Golombek. She received her BA from Barnard College in 1962 and her PhD from the University of Michigan in 1968 under the supervision of Professor Ole Grabar. She was curator of Islamic art at the Royal Ontario Museum from 1967 to 2005, and concurrently professor at the University of Toronto. She is currently curator emeritus and professor emeritus at both institutions. Her 5 books and over 70 articles cover a wide range of topics, including architecture, epigraphy, textiles, and Persian gardens. In terms of ceramics, Dr. Golombek began her studies during university with both pottery and glazed chemistry classes. Her first scholarly contribution to the field was her article, Plated Kufic on Samanid Epigraphic Pottery, which considered the dating of Samanid epigraphic pottery on the basis of the plated Kufic lettering found on dated coins. And she published this article in 1966 in Ars Orientalis. A key number of her many subsequent significant contributions to the study of Islamic ceramics arose from her collaborative research with Robert Mason. Their two monographs on Timurid and Safavid pottery demonstrate how combining art historical enquiry with archaeological science can yield a more precise and in-depth understanding of Islamic ceramics. Her current project, also with Robert Mason, deals with Safavid cuerda seca tiles, and her presentation today, titled Recycling the Safavids, the case of the garden panel in the Masjid-e-Imam Shah, Esfahan, will further illuminate this exciting project. I would urge all of the viewers to contribute questions using the Q&A feature, which will be moderated continuously during the lecture for the discussion session which will follow. Thank you. And now, please join with me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Golombek.
Lisa, we can't hear you.
Okay, let's start again. Hello, everyone. Sorry, I was unmuted before. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this remarkable conference, Miriam Rosser-Owen and Leslie Mickelson. Remarkable as it is focused on a single but complex medium produced by a single but by no means homogeneous society. I was looking forward to hearing Oliver Watson's talk, as I'm sure you are also, but I hope you will enjoy hearing about the subject I have chosen. Ceramics come in many different forms, shapes, sizes, colors, but one thing they have in common: they never die. While other media can be burnt, melted, dismembered, potsherds survive, and architectural tiles may find another host. I'm going to speak today about tiles produced in Safavid Iran in the 17th century and their afterlife. That is, once their original context had morphed or had disappeared. This talk follows a detour from the major research project I'm currently working on with Robert Mason of the Royal Ontario Museum. Our previous collaborations on Timurid and Safavid pottery had relied heavily on petrographic analysis of the stone paste ceramic bodies to determine provenance and ultimately the history of the Timurid and Safavid ceramic industries. A couple of years ago, Robert and I independently started working on another set of ceramic objects, Safavid cuerda seca tiles. The impetus came from several pictorial tile arches that the Royal Ontario Museum, which we'll call the ROM, had acquired in 1976 from the Kevorkian collection sale at Sotheby's Park, Burnay, and which were mounted in our new gallery in the 1980s. The cuerda seca, or dry cord technique, as evolved in Iran and Central Asia from the 14th century on, required several stages. A tile, usually clay-bodied, was covered with a white opaque glaze and fired. Then the outlines of the scene were painted on in a black oily substance. Colored glazes were applied, but areas intended to remain white, mostly the faces, were not painted. After another firing, the faces and other details were brushed in, allowing for very fine detail before another firing. And here you see one of the museum's arch panels featuring 3 mounted warriors slaying 2 dragons. It is a scene that could easily have been inspired by the great Persian epic, the Shahnameh. Robert talks about these in the tile session, so I hope you'll try to catch it if you haven't already. And I recently learned about another tile arch that is in the current exhibition, Epic Iran, at the V&A. Not sure whether this belongs with the group we're studying. Perhaps you'll share your opinion with us when you see it. These tile arches had been at the ROM over 40 years before I decided it was time to take another look at them. My interest was rekindled when I was asked to write up something about 2 Safavid tiles in the Aga Khan Museum. I saw immediately that these belonged technically and stylistically to the Safavid arcade group. I was aware that several more tile arches were out there, such as those acquired by Dr. Ingeborg Luschei-Schmeisser for the Linden Museum in Stuttgart, also from a Kevorkian sale, and others which she mentioned in her publications. At the same time as I started working on these irises, Robert Mason was working on the glazes of the tile arches. And in the ROM storerooms, he came across a large group of odd Safavid tiles that had come with the 2 arches from that auction sale, but which did not seem to make up a recognizable panel. So he began searching the web for more tiles that belong with these, which is where we once again coincided. I was searching for the original panel from which the Aga Khan irises came. We eventually did find it, but that's a story that Robert tells in his conference talk. So as I was Googling Persian Cuerda Seca tiles, I came across a lot of tiles that clearly did not belong to this arcade group. They represented a completely different style and appeared to belong to panels with a specific theme not found in the arcade panels, the Paradise Garden. When I asked my colleague Farshid Emami if he was familiar with these tiles, he drew my attention to a related panel in the mosque built by Shah Abbas in Isfahan, now called the Masjid-i-Imam. Prior to the revolution, it was known as the Masjid-i-Shah, the King's Mosque, but its original name was the Masjid-i-Jadid, the new mosque, to differentiate it from Isfahan's venerable old mosque. Most of you know this mosque well, and many of you have visited it. Built by Shah Abbas in his new capital, Isfahan, in 1611, it crowns the southwestern end of the Royal Maidan, the enormous civic plaza you see down on the left. To the north of this plaza stands the entrance to the bazaar. To the west, once sprawled the palace grounds, gardens, workshops, and storehouses, almost all of which have disappeared. The splendor of this mosque begins on the outside, with its great blue dome and its tiled entrance, but the interior is even more stunning. The entire mosque is revetted with Cuerda Seca tile panels, vertical panels along the walls, and curving panels fitted to the shape of the vaults and the spectacular dome. Throughout this expansive tile, the themes are always abstract and vegetal, in keeping with the avoidance of animate subjects in the sacred spaces of Islam. The compositions vary, but almost always feature a large central motif standing out amidst scrolling vines and flowers, much like as in a Safavid vase cupboard. The panel is bordered by floral scrolls, mimicking the borders of carpets. Edging all of the tile panels is a band of diagonal stripes, like a barbershop pole. The spandrels usually have a background in contrasting color to the panel, and these are covered with scrolls bearing very large blossoms and multi-petaled rosettes. Now you can imagine my surprise when I saw a photo of this panel, which was referred to by Fashid and captured by Daniel Waugh and available on ArchNet. Your eyes are startled by the menagerie of animals spread out among plants and soaring cypress trees. Here we see animals such as peacocks, deer and stags, leopards, even monkeys. Now, peacocks are indeed found on the great entrance, here in mosaic tile. But in the Cuerda Seca panel, there is a whole menagerie. A garden theme with trees and flowers would normally be okay in a mosque, as it evokes paradise, but not with animals. What was this panel doing inside a mosque? And the panel with the animals is not situated in an out-of-view location. And I thank again Daniel Waugh for his photographs and for this plan showing exactly where the panel sits. As you face the Qibla to your left, behind the courtyard wall, this strange panel is set within an arched recess, the same size and shape as its neighbors. It stands out because its background color is yellow, while the neighboring panels are blue and bear only abstract and vegetal motifs. Yet, it incorporates some of the motifs that appear throughout the mosque, such as the multifoil or cloud collar medallions that form the axes of these panels. Let's take a closer look now at this animated panel. The animals populate a landscape dominated by tall, slender cypresses and numerous flowering plants. Forming both vertical and horizontal axes are the cloud color medallions and vases with splayed multifoil feet. There are 3 vertical axes demarcated by the 3 vases in the center. The central axis extends from the vase through a medallion and up through the cypress to the apex. In the middle of the panel, the 3 vases create a lateral axis, which is the central zone. And there are 2 zones above it and 1 below that lacks an axial marker. The 4 zones are bracketed by cypress trees that ascend as a triangle. The design is roughly symmetrical on either side of the central axis. The same flora and fauna appear in the same order on both sides. Furthermore, the motifs serving to create the axes of the panel, the medallions, the vases, and the cypress, constitute axes of their own, the flora and fauna on one side being the antithesis of the other. These form mini pictures with the axial motif flanked by animals. But it does not take long to see that while the panel is thoughtfully composed, and thus may fit in aesthetically with its neighbors, it is a pastiche. Many of the tiles have been cut down to create the desired composition. In this section, you can see, first of all, a variation in the coloration of the yellow ground. Then it is apparent that tiles have been cut to fit, such as the tile showing the animals. On the far left, lower left, the brown horned animal's hindquarters belong to the tile below, which has insects. And this tile is now half the width of the normal tile. And the hindquarters of the comparable animal flanking the cypress on the other side has been cut off below the animal's feet to display the bouquet in the zone below. On the right side of this slide, I've drawn lines to point out that some of these modifications of the original tiles were intended to create frames around the individual pictures, a picture being a single tree with its flanking fauna, these mini pictures. To be noted is the fact that most of the animals were reproduced by stencils or even by block printing. The group of stags and deer appears several times, especially in the lower zones. I've circled the ones on the left side of the axis. There are as many on the right side. I've actually done a systematic study of this panel tile by tile, but I don't want to bore you with that. Here I've outlined the individual tiles in red to show where the tiles have been cut. Whoever assembled this was concerned with maintaining the 3 vertical axes and the 4 horizontal zones. I now apologize for introducing a topic that some of you may find boring, that is, borders. Boring as they may be, borders can be an important indicator of affiliation. That is, as we found on Timurid and Safavid pottery, borders tend to be territorial. That is, they may suggest individual workshops, date, provenance, etc. So now we turn to this border. The entire panel is framed by tiles that have a border band running along one edge, or 2 if it's a corner, as you see on the right. Here this band has a narrow guard of interlocking or reciprocal chevrons on the outside and a wider frieze of scrolling plant motifs on the inside. A 5-petal rosette with white petals accented in black alternates with a spongy motif. The vertical and horizontal sides of the panel are bordered by full-size tiles that are integrated into the design of the adjoining tiles. In other words, the border bands are what I call embedded in the tiles belonging to the field. Then along the oblique sides, that is the arch itself, these borders had to be cut off from their field tiles so they could fit along the curve. As it became evident that this panel was assembled from tiles made for another venue, I found myself pulled in several different directions. Where did the tiles come from? When were they removed from their original site? And who done it? I thought it best to organize this search in 4 stages. First, the intrinsic. Queries arising from the object itself. What were the manufacturing techniques, the compositional schema, the framing device? Second, context. Where did these tiles come from? What was their original context? What was their date of manufacture? And how were they originally displayed? 3, out of context. At some point, the original context disappeared. When did this happen? And then 4, the new context. When were the tiles reassembled, by whom, and why? As we've already dealt with the intrinsic features of the panel as it presents itself today, I'd like to turn next to the question of context. What were the possible sources for these tiles? The mosque panel shares many characteristics with a genre of cuerda seca panels that could be called the Paradise Garden theme, or just garden theme. Here are 2 that illustrate the theme well. There is a central motif creating an axis, on either side of which flourish various trees, plants, and often animals. The design itself is symmetrical, one side exactly reflecting the other. The axial motif may be a medallion, a vase, or a tree. These garden-themed panels from the Ashmolean Museum and the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha are made from the same cartoon. The Ashmolean panel has an axial trefoil medallion, similar to those of the mosque panel. A pair of tall cypress trees flank the medallion, and pairs of deer appear at the sides. The composition is symmetrical, with the medallion serving as the central axis. The Doha panel appears to be missing the central tiles. The fields are filled with plants with large blossoms far larger than the animals. That's a characteristic of this genre. It would seem that the mosque panel could have been constructed from something like these. However, two features suggest that this group was not the source. First, the artist has distinguished between the land, which is green, and the sky, which is yellow. Thus, these features, land and sky, create a sort of setting for this paradise scene, much as we actually see in the well-known Safavid pictorial panels, such as this one in the V&A. These feature the beautiful people of Isfahan in leisurely pursuits. This V&A panel shows us a courtesan being entertained in an outdoor setting by a man and being served by a woman and a young man. The figures are situated on a green foreground, beyond which lie white hills, and above these, a blue sky. Furthermore, the border of the Ashmolean group is not identical to that of the mosque panel. It suggests something very different, another workshop or date. It does have the reciprocal chevron on the outer band, but the inner band is composed of serrated sickle-shaped leaves alternating with a large stylized peony and 5-petaled rosette. According to Michael Francis, this border is derived from the sickle leaf border of Kerman carpets from the late 16th to early 17th century. Thus, the Ashmolean Doha version of the garden theme panel most likely was not the source for the tiles that ended up in the mosque panel. There are other garden panels in various collections, but the group that most closely relates to the mosque panel is to be found at Shangri-La, the Museum of Islamic Art in Honolulu, mounted in the courtyard. This large, extraordinary group should be studied in detail. Here we discover the same mode of production noted in the mosque panel, repetition. The central panel has two vases forming the axis, but the cartoon was used for top and bottom. Likewise, the narrow panel, shown here on the right, has been made from some of the same tiles as the larger one, top left. Note the spotted leopard among swaying weeds in the lowest row, picked out in the detail below. This is a reverse of the same animals in the central panel shown above it here. So here there is a relationship with the mosque panel in that both employed repetitions and reversals of the same cartoons. Presumably, this workshop made dozens of the same tile, including its reverse, and left it to the artist to compose the panel. In addition to the complete panels with garden theme in various museums, many single tiles that come on the art market from time to time might have originated in the same place as tiles from the mosque panel. You can see in this group, which I showed at the beginning, the variation in style, some very fine, while others less so. On the left are 3 tiles that appeared on the market separately, but which seem to once have been together. And note those embedded borders. Now that we've established the genre of object that the mosque panel is built up from, we come to the question of the dating of this object. The only group with an alleged provenance are those at Shangri-La, and I thank Leslie Mickelson for informing me that they were mostly purchased from Rabbeinu, who said that they came from an Armenian house in New Julfa. In view of a lack of further detail from Rabbeinu, we may assume that the others also came from similar sites, the houses of wealthy Armenians, some of which still stand. For those of you who are not familiar with Safavid Isfahan, here's a map of the modern city. Please ignore the streets. As you can see, the city is divided by a river, the Zayanda Rud, into a northern and southern area. On the north was the old pre-Safavid city, just above that red circle. The red circle represents the urban innovations of Shah Abbas beginning around 1600. Here was the Royal Maidan, the mosque we are talking about, and the palace precincts. South of the river is New Julfa, here circled in blue, where the Armenian quarter was established. I'll speak in a moment about this area circled in green, which was the site of another royal estate, Saadat-abad. In 1606, Shah Abbas I forcibly moved the wealthy merchant community of Armenian Nakhchivan to Isfahan and established this area south of the river as their exclusive quarter. They prospered from control of the silk trade and built impressive churches for the community and many richly adorned houses for themselves. The tile panels would have come from some of these houses, but the closest kinship with the tiles of the mosque panel are those of a church. The Bethlehem or Bethlehem Church was built in 1627. In addition to the European-style paintings, it retains these beautiful Cuerda Seca tile dados. Here's one of the panels. You can see immediately its relationship with the Shangri-La panels and the mosque panel. The vase with splayed foot, the horned animals, the composition, even the border tiles of the mosque panel appear to have come from a panel similar to this one. Note that the composition is based on the vertical axis of the vase and that it is flanked by identical pairs of animals, as well as slender trees with their menagerie. The artist has reversed the details from one side to the other, but he's also taken certain liberties. For example, there is a fox on the far left, or some kind of animal, which is missing on the right. Not only is there a relationship between the composition of these dados and the pictures that were created within the mosque panel, the treatment of the borders is similar. The church panels have two framing bands. The horizontal outer bands have reciprocal chevrons, while the vertical bands have interlocking chevrons. Like the borders of the mosque panel, the inner frieze is a floral scroll and also has flowers with 5 white petals with black accents, similar to what we've seen in the mosque panel. The alternating motif is slightly different, so the borders are not completely identical. They are close enough to pair these dados with the tiles from the mosque. In both, the border tiles belong to the panel. That is, the bands are embedded in the outer rows of tiles. They are not separate tiles applied around the arch-shaped panel. Thus, the borders belong to the original tiles of the panels from which they were taken. Now, can we date the tiles from the mosque panel on the basis of their relationship with the dados of this church, circa 1627? Maybe we could, but we don't know if the dados were part of the original decoration of the church or were put in place later. Research in the church archives might someday reveal this answer. Now, we've just noted that the house of an Armenian was the source of the garden-themed panels at Shangri-La. No doubt the houses of Safavid royalty and nobility could also have provided such material. The Safavid Shahs had many progeny who lived in mansions outside the royal precincts. One such house is described by the French jeweler Jean Chardin, who wrote extensively about his visits to Iran in the mid-17th century. In his travelogue, he describes the mansion of a Safavid prince, Mirza Rezi. It had abstract or floral-themed tiles in the buildings nearest the entrance to the harem, but it had figural tiles in the innermost rooms. Safavid palaces may also have been the source of such panels. A series of garden-themed panels were offered from the Kevorkian collection in New York in the late 1920s, their provenance having been given as the Half-Dast Palace of Isfahan. I was very excited to read this until I looked closely at the photographs. The images in the Anderson Gallery catalog of 1927 New York are poor, but it is evident that these panels could not have been made by the royal workshops of Safavid Isfahan, or even for any royal building. I say that because the motifs are not properly aligned, as they would be in a Safavid panel. The medallions or trees, as you see here in the photograph, are not centered on the tiles, they're off-center. The drawing is imprecise. I would judge this group to be copies of Safavid originals. And on the right of the slide, the panel in Brooklyn may be one of these copies. It follows the Safavid aesthetic, but the drawing of the deer below seems a bit shoddy. 2 points are noteworthy about this group of garden-themed panels. The dealer attributed them to the Half-Dast Palace. More on this in a moment. And the dimensions of these dado panels, there were quite a few in the auction. If you place them end to end, it comes to about 50 feet, which would make a fairly large room. So these panels most likely do come from a single impressive building. Was it in fact the Half-Dast? Back to the map. This palace stood in the Sadadabat royal precincts on the south bank of the Zayandarud River. And you see it here in green, not far from New Julfa. This vast royal garden estate was expanded by Shah Abbas II around 1650, and it covered a bit of the north side of the river and mostly lay on the south side. The Half-Dast was a large courtyard-centered residence for the Shah and his household, surrounded by gardens and standing near the Ayin-e-Khaneh, a largest pavilion which overlooked the river and had been built around 1630, that is somewhat earlier. The Half-Dast Palace was still in use in the mid-19th century. It was renovated by the Qajar ruler, Fath Ali Shah, who loved it and died there in 1834. Now, while we're here, just check out those fancy armlets, which came into fashion at this time. I'll come back to this in a moment. If there is any truth to the dealer's attribution that the Neo-Safavid panels came from the Half-Dast Palace, they may have been made for this Qajar ruler's renovations. Instead of following the current fashions, artists seem to have been instructed to copy what was left of the Safavid garden panels, perhaps still gracing the walls of the Safavid wings in this palace. This choice testifies to the admiration in which the Qajars held their Safavid legacy. The Qajars' reception of their Safavid past is the theme that drives me to my conclusions about the creations of the mosque panel. Now we come to the next stage. What happened to the buildings in which all these garden-themed panels were installed? A stage which I call out of context. More specifically, what happened to the original site of the tiles that ended up in the mosque panel? And when did this occur? How can we determine this? The reports of foreign travelers about the Safavid buildings, as well as local histories, have been studied by scholars such as Heinz Luschai and Willem Flor. Consensus is that the Safavid buildings survived in some form until purposely demolished around 1900 by the governor Zilla Sultan. The wholesale removal of tiles from pre-modern buildings began by the late 19th century. Safavid tiles started to reach European museums around 1890. But those large panels with depiction of the Safavid courtesans that I showed earlier were already removed between 1881 and 1884. Much of what has ended up in museums came from the enterprises of Arab Kevorkian. This occurred during the first decades of the 20th century. However, as the old buildings deteriorated during the course of the 19th century, it's very likely that the beautiful tiles were being scavenged by locals. Some of these must have been salvaged to create the mosque panel. There was, in fact, a great deal of interest in Safavid art under the Qajars, as we know more now from the work of Moya Kari and Heidi Walcher. The Qajars emulated and imitated Safavid art, and I would like to add to the evidence that they have presented with 3 examples of the Qajars copying or emulating Safavid tile panels. The first 2 examples relate to the Safavid arcade panels. In the course of our study of the large group of tile arches from the reign of Shah Suleiman, created around 1685, with which I began this talk, we've discovered at least 6 copies. The copies of these Safavid arches were painted in 2 different styles, both attributable to Qajar artists. The Safavid panel depicting a boar hunt, now in Hamburg, on your left, was copied rather poorly and arrived in Chicago as its copy already before 1926, you see on the right. That was long before the original ended up in Hamburg, which I believe was in 1980. In the copy on the right, the same 3 horsemen are shown, but the man hunting boar at the bottom has been squished into the space left after the artist tried copying the other 2 hunters, and the boar have disappeared. But note the border. This copy is important because it has a border, here embedded in the field tiles. The preservation of this design in the copy suggests that the original Safavid arch bearing the boar hunt scene, which you see on the left, had a similar border, but it has disappeared because the border tiles were separate. They were not embedded. When was the copy done? I can only venture a guess. The horsemen wear armbands, which, as I pointed out earlier, became fashionable under Fath Ali Shah. You see in this detail. Returning to the question of the border tiles, Safavid border tiles similar to the border bands embedded in the fields of this Qajar copy arrived in Berlin as early as 1891, as you see in this photo from their storage. So whoever copied the boar hunt and several other Safavid arch panels was very careful to recreate the original, include the border. The conclusion I'm leading toward is that the Qajar artist had original Safavid tiles in front of him and tried to recreate them as best as he could. In a very different style are 3 tile panels also modeled on surviving Safavid tile arches. This one in the British Museum depicts the story recounted by Nizami of the Sasanian king Bahram Gur, who is journeying in the countryside in disguise to see how his subjects are getting on. He wanders into a village, shown here as a campsite, with tents and a woman spinning and a man playing his flute. To the right of the tents, you see the shepherd raising his right arm, which holds a long stick, and in front of him, you see the poor dog that he's hung from a tree and is beating to death as a punishment for allowing the sheep to be devoured by a wolf. The panel actually shows the shepherd twice, once beating the dog, and the second being interviewed by the king, who's mounted. The king, identified by his crown, raises his finger to his lips as a gesture of surprise, and below is a stream stretching across the lower part of the arch. Lushai Schmeisser, who first published this panel, noted her awareness of tiles that belonged to another panel with the same scene, but she did not conclude that one was a later copy of the other. In what I call the Qajar version, details of the story are all there, but the distortion of the hats and the turbans belies copying something that was not current, it was not understood. The original actually does belong with the Safavid arcade panels and has been assembled by Robert Mason from tiles in several museum and sales catalogs, as you see here on the right. Note that this Qajar copy on the left preserves the Safavid border just as the previous copy did, although the panels were done by different craftsmen. Both examples prove that the original tile panels were still in situ, presumably on the buildings, when the copies were made, as the copyists must have seen the original border tiles in order to copy them. Once the tile arches were removed and sent out on the art market, the borders of all but several smaller arches went missing. Secondly, these copies show that there was great interest in Safavid arts in the 19th century. It'd be nice to be able to say just when these copies were made and whether they served a local purpose or were intended for export, but I can't say right now. They do reflect the admiration that the Qajars bore towards Safavid arts. That the garden theme was especially loved during the Qajar period, we can see in this panel from the Topkhana Meydan, made around 1800. The Topkhana Meydan was a civic plaza in Tehran as the city was recreated under the Qajars. It was decorated with tile panels, and you can see that this panel draws inspiration from Safavid garden-themed panels and bears testimony that such panels could still be seen and appreciated in the early 19th century in Isfahan. The existence of so many and such varied copies of the tile arches, as well as the garden-themed dados, suggests that the Safavid buildings bearing these were still standing when the copies were made. We should also take note that the university in Tehran, the Dar al-Funun, began to expand its curriculum at this time to include the arts. Or perhaps one of the students' assignments was to go to Isfahan and reproduce Safavid tiles. We come now to the final stage, the new context. Where does this leave our mystery panel in the Masjid-i-Imam of Isfahan? That it was assembled from multiple garden-themed panels of the mid-17th century is evident, as each vase or medallion might represent only one panel. Two moments during the Qajar period seem plausible for this fabrication. The first would be during the reign of Fath Ali Shah, in the course of general renovations, that is, between, say, 1800 and 1830. The second likely time would have been the late 19th century, when the Safavid buildings were being torn down and scavenged for tiles to sell on the European market, say around 1885. Either of these moments seem plausible. Perhaps someone will find a document referring to the creation of the mosque panel as a donation or waqf to the mosque. Tiles are a medium that have their own set of rules as well as trajectory. Tiles are easy to reuse. They're admired for the beauty of their colors, the sparkle of their glaze, whether or not they make up a complete picture. Tiles from the Safavid arcade are now highly valued and selling for tens and thousands of dollars for a single tile. There are many examples in the pre-modern Islamic world of older tiles being appreciated for their beauty and given new life, such as the well-known blue and white panels on the far right in the Sunat Odase of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, They were made in 1529, but remounted in 1640 in the new kiosk. So it is not surprising that during the Qajar period, someone scavenged the deteriorating or demolished Safavid palaces to save what was considered beautiful. They took great care in recreating the feeling of a Safavid garden panel with its sets of axes, medallions, cypress trees, and its antithetical groupings of animals. They utilized the border tiles, once edging the Safavid panels, and used them to frame this arch-shaped frieze. In short, they created a new work of art.
Lisa, thank you very much for that brilliant presentation.
Pleasure.
I would now like to invite all of the participants to feel free to ask questions using the Q&A feature. And in the meantime, I will selfishly use the position as moderator to ask my question first, if you don't mind, Lisa. And I would like to ask you about the idea of legibility of the scenes on the panels. And I'm curious as to whether or not in the context, these would have been seen as, for lack of a better term, background noise, or if they would have been the subjects of some scrutiny. And I ask that particularly in regard to your discussion of the post-Safavid Qajar use of some of these spaces.
Of course, it's hard to know without getting some kind of eyewitness report about that, but my guess would be that imagery like this was intended really to bring the outside in, that is, to create gardens within a building. And, you know, gardens have many, many different meanings, and, you know, going all the way from the religious to the secular and to the sense of power and, the king controlling the paradise and all that. But I think that sort of the average noble person who owned a house with these dados must have had the idea when he entered the space that he was still outside. He was still within a beautiful garden and could imagine the flowers, the scents, the bird song, and all of that. So that's just a guess, and so that would, so I don't know. I guess in a sense it's noise, but it could be that that they did get that feeling. On the other hand, there may also be this whole idea of puzzle, depending on how well done, how well thought these were, such as the dado I showed you where there was one animal that was unique, and maybe that was a challenge to people to hunt out all the animals to identify things. So that we can only guess until somebody comes up with an eyewitness report on this. So well, thank you for your question.
Of course, Lisa, thank you, and that's fascinating to think about. I'm gonna peruse that for a while. I would like to now start opening the Q&A to some of our participants. And I have a question from Miriam, actually. And she asks, you mentioned the Dar al-Funun in Tehran in the early 19th century and the expansion of the curriculum to include ceramics. Miriam asks, I am just wondering what else we know about this art school and what ceramic techniques it taught. Could it have taught luster, for example?
I'm afraid I haven't been able to get any more information on that. The best I could do was, in reading about it, that under the influence of people like Richard and Lemaire, there was a move toward incorporating. Before that, the university was strictly sciences and medicine, but this move toward the arts came in the 1880s and 1870s or so, and it would be nice to know more about that. Of course, this is the time when the treatise on ceramics was written. So, perhaps, someday we could find more about the curriculum. I don't know of any objects that were produced by students of the school, but that's something that perhaps someone sitting in Tehran might be able to find out. Perhaps these ended up in the museum there.
Well, it's definitely a rich vein of inquiry, I think. I think we can all agree on that. I have a question from Margaret Graves. And it's very interesting, Lisa, because you and I were just speaking about the idea of the nomenclature of Hofdast. And Margaret asks, she says, thank you for this fascinating work. I am curious about the Hofdast Palace. I believe that the Hofdast Palace was also claimed to be the site of origin for a large number of lacquer doors that appeared on the market sold by Kevorkian, including 6 sold in 1927. Margaret's PhD student, Sherry Lee, has been working on this material. And Margaret asks, could the Hofdast Palace be just a convenient site usefully gone by the early 20th century peak of dealing to attribute things, spuriously attribute things to, and give them a veneer of glamour and legitimacy? Do we know of anything that definitively came from there?
I would say, no, we don't. And I would say, yes, that's certainly a possibility. But it just seemed to me a likelihood that since it was still in use under Fath Ali Shah, and there are also, we know of embassies of, can't remember which is some British embassy, stayed there in the 1860s or so. So it was still a viable place. It was still usable and it wasn't run down. So that it probably was decorated. So it seems a logical place for stuff to come from. Now, why Kevorkian might have, or not him, but maybe the people that gathered the tiles for him in Iran, why they would invent that name, I don't know. There were sort of better known palaces that might appeal more to Europeans. That name, the Hofdast, actually is one that we see in 19th century sources, such as the map that I showed you, and the auction catalogs, and, well, word of mouth, the reports of the British who stayed there. On the other hand, Chardin doesn't name this, doesn't say that the Hofdast is this great big residential building. He seems to imply that it's a group of maybe 7 Haft buildings scattered around in the Saadabad complex. But I'm working with the 19th century definition since that's what the dealer used.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that seems
yeah.
very accurate. Well, I look forward to hearing what Sherry digs up in her PhD research. I think that we'll be all looking forward to those conclusions. Lisa, I have a question from Lindsay Allen, and first of all, thank you for this extremely rich paper. Can I ask whether we can introduce the possibility that Safavid structures were deliberately stripped for the market, perhaps after Qajar copying had created a desire for the originals among higher paying and perhaps foreign patrons? It would fit rather better with the looting activity in earlier mosques in the late 19th century.
Yeah, I'm sure that happened, but we know that the buildings were actually demolished around 1902, something like that. So I would assume that, but in the 80s, when interest started to grow in the ceramics, in part because of all the expositions in Europe, that I'm sure that people were stripping these things. But I guess my point was that these copies were made before they were stripped, and therefore they're a very valuable source of what originals look like if we're missing the originals. And there are in fact several of these copies which are done in the same style as ones we have the originals for, but we don't have the originals. So so one of these, by the way, is a copy of your encampment scene in Shangri-La. So
yes, I was looking at that with hawk eyes, and I think that
Right.
We'll definitely be having more conversations about that. That was very exciting. Right. I have a query for you from an anonymous participant, and this person says, "Thank you for a wonderful paper, Dr. Golombek. I would love to hear your thoughts about whether we might frame this as a form of antiquarianism in the Islamic world. Could you share your thinking about how widespread such practices of appreciative reuse were in the post-Safavid period, and what it might have signaled for Qajar viewers?"
That's a very interesting question. I'm afraid my arrival in the Qajar period is rather late, and quite accidental. I really didn't intend to end up there, but that's where this talk took me, and it's a very interesting question, and I would assume that it is a form. I would think that the Qajars were sophisticated enough to be antiquarian at that point. I'm not sure about Fath Ali Shah. I don't really know enough about his taste, whether he really saw himself as an heir to the Safavids, or whether he just thought this was really nice stuff, let's repeat it and do more of it. But maybe somebody who's more into Fath Ali Shah could tell us. As an absolutely fascinating character, and we really should know more about his taste.
I have a query from Peter Lawson, who says, "Thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering if there is significance to the color palettes used, yellow and green, blue and white, etc., and if that changes based on stylistic traditions, and if that has any bearing on tracing copied work."
I kind of veer away from symbolic, attributing symbolism to color, unless we're dealing with, the story of Bahramgur or something like that. I think to some extent it's what the ceramic artist feels will come out best. And interestingly enough, in these tile arches that Robert Mason and I are studying, where we found that there are there's always a twin, and sometimes they're both with the same color background, sometimes they're two different colors, they're not always the same two different colors, so it's really hard to know what drove this, and I don't even think that it was their placement on the wall. It may just have been whim, now I'm going to do a white background, now I'm going to do a yellow background. Of course, in the mosque, there had to be a unity, and so all of those arch panels have a blue ground in that particular area. I think most of these garden panels seem to be yellow, but I think some are white. So yeah, I can't give a definitive answer to your question. Sorry, we'd like to know more about that. Yeah.
I think one of the wonderful things is that we don't have all the answers, right? And part of the conference is to stimulate queries and to share that with others. So I think that it just shows us how deep the vein is for mining of this topic. I think that that's really wonderful. And I should also add that the question about appreciative reuse in the Qajar period was actually from Stephanie Mulder. So we're having a very rich discussion with a lot of our participants, which I enjoy and encourage. We have two questions, one from an anonymous participant and one from Moya Carey, that are very similar. And they both ask how these panels compare to other tiles from early 19th century Esfahan, particularly those in the Masjid Hakim and Sayed and the madrasas. And Moya elaborates, and she writes, they seem quite different also to Ali Muhammad Esfahani's 1880s work. She also notes for our edification that in the 1850s and 1860s, that there was direct correspondence between Dar al-Funun's chemist Faketi and Sèvres about ceramic production, which is really quite.
That's very interesting, yeah.
Yeah, so Moya and our anonymous viewer are asking about how these tiles compare to other, especially Qajar area mosques in Esfahan.
Okay, I'm afraid that she knows much more about that than I do. I have not studied the Qajar tiles. All I know is that from looking at whatever is available, they're very different. The technique looks very different from what we see, which makes these copies strange, because you'd think that, they'd be making stuff in the current style, but they don't. They seem to be trying to reproduce Safavid aesthetics and quality. But no, I look forward to hearing more from Moya about that.
Absolutely. We also have a comment from Oliver. Hello, Oliver. We have a comment from Oliver in which he writes, I believe there is a dish in the Louvre which is inscribed as having been made in the Dar al-Funun. So that's really quite fascinating as well. And I'm sure will merit more inquiry as we continue. Moya has another question in which she has a statement and then a question. And the statement is, naming a better known site would certainly stimulate the art market appetite. I think this is in regard to the Haftast query that we were speaking about earlier. And she says, certainly this is a topic worthy of more investigation. And she also asks, did Pope's photo survey include this garden panel in the Masjid-i-Shah, by the way? Do we know if that was included in Pope's photographic survey?
That's a good question. I'll have to look into that. I kind of doubt it, because you'd think that it would have drawn attention before now. But I will check that. No, it was actually, I didn't know about it either until Farshid Emami told me to go to ArchNet and look at this photograph. And I was quite taken. It took me a while before I really realized what was going on there. And so that was quite fascinating.
Absolutely, absolutely. Very exciting. Yeah. Well, our questions seem to have drawn to a kind of a natural close. So I'll wait just a moment or two in case anyone would like to ask any last-minute questions. But in the meantime, I would like to thank you once again, Lisa, for this fascinating lecture, which, as we've just noted, have brought up so many more questions, not because of a lack of preparation, but because of the great stimulation of subjects that that the material proposes, and whether in terms of contextualization, in terms of historicism, in terms of collection, in terms of material science. I think it's quite obvious to everyone in the audience that there are so many projects that can emerge out of what you've been presenting, and that's very, very exciting to see how this develops.
And I do hope that those of you out there who have any more insights, and especially the younger scholars and students, graduate students, might pick up one of these threads and run with it, and that would be great.
Inshallah, yes, I think that would be really wonderful. Right. Well, thank you again, Lisa, for that wonderful.
Thank you very much for organizing.
Yes, it was a great pleasure. And to all of our audience members, thank you again for joining us from around the globe. We hope that you found this stimulating, and we look forward to your joining us throughout the week. We'd just like to remind everyone that the first panel discussion will be tomorrow at 12 noon British Summer Time. And I will allow you all to translate that into your own individual time zones. But at 12 noon British Summer Time tomorrow will be our first panel discussion. And you will find the link in the chat feature as well. So if you, if you have any queries or any questions, you can continue adding those into the Q&A feature. And in the meantime, we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow and throughout the week. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a lovely evening. And again, Eid Mubarak for our colleagues who are celebrating.